Hi everyone, I'm Cal Spriggs. Today I'm going to show you how I built the second of my epic Gallowdark terrain tiles for playing with Warhammer 40k, Necromunda, Kill Team, and other sci-fi wargames. In my previous video I walked through how I built my first tile for the Gallowdark boarding action set. Like the first one, I wanted a tile with depth, something that provided some height variation and allowed models to traverse the underdecks of the ship. I had issues on the first build with the big section of plastic mesh grating, so this time I built up some understructure and grating tiles to be a sturdier build, and also because I figured it would look better. The first thing I did was measure out and cut 1-inch wide strips of thick cardstock. This provided me with a framework moving forward, as the deck supports that I printed were 1 inch on a side. I cut 3 of these at first because I wasn't exactly sure how I wanted them, and I wanted to visualize it on the tile before I did any more. I planned to have tunnel sections on 2 sides of the tile, which I wanted to allow movement of the models under the deck plates, avoiding the walls and doors above, similar to the last tile section. What that meant was the underdecking had to fit with those there, without ruining the connection of the tunnel to the tile's base. I also had to make sure that the supports lined up with the deck plates above them. If they weren't in the right places, then the deck plates wouldn't line up and the whole build wouldn't work. So I had a sample tile that I placed in marked areas to get the spacing right. It was a finicky bit that if I didn't get right, it would all be wasted time. Since I would be magnetizing the deck plates to the pillar supports, I had some leeway here, but I still wanted it all to look straight and fit up as well as possible. Once I had the spacing down, I worked on the cross braces. These were again 1-inch strips of thick cardstock. I wanted to make enough for the whole project, so I took the time to make extra sections, measuring and cutting them so I was sure I had enough. When doing a big project like this, it often saves a lot of time to do a bunch of the same parts all in one go, rather than making as many as you think you need for the task at hand. I kept the offcuts from these, as these little scraps can be battlefield debris and fallen pieces of deck plating later. With the cross braces cut, I could lay them out and see how they all lined up. It made a sort of girder or skeletal skyscraper feel, which was neat, as it suggested that there were more levels below, and that got to some of what I was trying to achieve here. With the edges of each section lined out, I measured and cut plastic grating to fit between them. This solidified the industrial look that I was going for this underdeck area to be a part of the workings of the ship. For anyone who has ever been aboard a naval or maritime ship, this is similar to the bilge area, where all sorts of pipes and conduits run, and where the junior enlisted or cadets go to chase after lost tools. I have an idea of doing a flooded or toxic waste tile and making the area covered in a resin or 3D printed sea of toxic waste, but that will have to wait for a later build. For this one I wanted to be relatively simple, with pipes interconnecting and the tunnel sections, so I cut 4 sections of grating for the underdeck surface and left it at that. Once I had all the pieces in place and saw how it looked, I used a hot glue gun to glue it all down. The cardstock would provide a far better support structure to the support beams than the mesh, and I didn't have a huge surface to try and glue down like on my first tile. When you do big surface areas with hot glue, the glue cools off at one side before you've finished applying it to the other. It can be really frustrating and make it so things don't stick. That's another reason to keep pieces relatively small, so you have time to apply them without the glue cooling too much on you. Overall, I was really happy with how this went together. And the cross braces, once glued into place, showed me exactly where I needed to place the support pillars for the deck. I love it when something comes together the way it's supposed to. Getting the support pillars down gave this thing the 3-dimensional framework and helped me to visualize where to go from here. I could also add the tunnel sections to the 2 sides now. These were a 3D print, and I liked tying them into the built-up board as access corridors running through the workings of the ship, so attackers and defenders can pop up in different areas. I had also used my 3D slicing software to adjust the connections on 2 of the tunnel sections so they met perfectly. It was a simple thing, but having them line up was a huge relief. I glued the tunnel sections down, and by this point I had the substructure complete and I could move on to the piping and interior workings of the subdeck. For building up the subdeck, like in the last build, I used some toy pipe connections I had bought online for some of these sections. There's a huge wheel or valve that I used to suggest that this was a crucial cutoff point for coolant to the reactors or something. I also used sections of wooden dowel to extend the length of the pipe sections so that I could get to different areas without having to use lots of the short, straight sections. I also had 3D printed some industrial style piping. It had some neat details on it to make it more interesting, and it's a larger size and different style, so it gave me some variation. The one section of piping is supposed to be coolant, so I figure this industrial piping will actually be a power conduit. In keeping with what I did on the first tile, I'll color code a lot of these sections of pipe to keep them visually separate and to tell a story about what they're carrying. Having multiple sets of piping moving in 3 dimensions adds to the visual interest, and in some areas I considered having sections of pipe come up through the deck. I didn't do that on this tile, but it gave me ideas for the next one. With the piping run, I went back through and added some other details to represent machinery, pedestals for equipment, bits of fallen deck plates, and that sort of thing. This is all there to give the place an abandoned and worn look. I also used straw sections to make thinner fuel and lubricant piping and to add variation to what I had there. With the interior built up, I turned the piece on its side to build the exterior walls. With tunnel sections on 2 sides, I only had to build out walls on the other 2 sides of the tile. I wanted to strike a balance here of grading that could be seen through and solid walls, which can be interesting enough without being too much of the same thing. I 3D printed some bulkheads for a bit more visual interest as well, but mostly I used cardstock and plastic mesh, cutting it to fit and then gluing each section into place. For some of the pipe sections, I made holes for the connections to go through, and in others I capped it off, adding visual detail on the outside to show up a plug or pump. For these tiles, I wanted them playable on my existing Necromunda Hive City terrain as well, so they're scaled at 2 inches, which means I can bridge between the bulkheads and columns in that set, and use these walls as dead ends for the lower levels of the Hive City terrain. I can also have the underdeck tunnels open out on a flat tile, so everything needs to look like it's tied together. With it being modular, I also have to make it so that all of the sides are playable. I'd gone far more industrial for most of the subdecks, but I still had some Gothic arches that I put here or there on bulkheads to call this back to the 41st millennium. The bulkheads and walls for the Gallowdark sets have some skulls too, so we should be good there. With the walls up, I took advantage of the warmer weather and primed it and started right into painting. I primed it a dark gray and then used the aqua color to paint the coolant pipes. Again, I used a stippling technique to give the pipe sections a patchwork look. I painted the smaller pipes yellow for lubricants and dry brushed the big power conduits in metallic. Once I had them painted, I shifted to weathering, applying burnt umber across the piece to weather and rust it all out. I applied a good coating of this everywhere, both on the subdeck and inside the access tunnels, to really sell that this ship has had centuries of hard use and very little maintenance. I really like how the big valve turned out, especially with the extra rust. It looks like it would take someone in power armor to even shift it a little bit. All the little bits of scattered plates and beams sell this place as being abandoned without making it look too cluttered, so it's still a playable area if I want, and there's also room for me to go back in and add lighting. This is the second tile that I built, and I was really happy with how all the different parts of it came together. It's still relatively simple, but it just has a cool vibe to it that really suggests the lower sections of an abandoned ship, and building it gave me lots of ideas of what I wanted to do in the next tile. I hit the whole subdeck with a brown wash, and then I moved right on to working on the deck plating. Like the first tile, I had magnetized all of the deck plates so I could work on the underdeck and get any models or bits that fell down below after I was done, and also to make it playable. I was careful to line up some of the hatches and panels on this deck with what was below, giving hints above as to what was going on underneath. I used contrast paints again here on some of the panels, blue and white to suggest a naval theme, using red and then yellow as callouts for hazards like the big hatch at the center that opens up to access the valve. I grimed up the area a bit with burnt umber, aging the metal and giving it a corroded look. I used thicker and thinner quantities on the brush, diluting it with water to get variations in the translucence of the paint. This allowed me to sell some areas as just dirty or greasy and others as having heavy rust. I liked playing with different aspects of this and seeing what the results were after it dried. About halfway through this process, I felt it needed something more, so I decided to add some yellow around the central hatch. I don't really have room there to do full hazard stripes, but the corner panels sell that there is something there to be aware of and to draw the eye. Similarly, on the big flat panel in the corner, I decided to add some lettering. Little bits of color here and there can really add to the piece, providing contrast to the dirty and dark look. I figured the warrens of decks can be confusing on a huge starship, so it wouldn't be out of place for the crew to stencil on labels to tell where people are. We do that on modern ships all the time, so it made sense to me. With the color on it, I came back with burnt umber and finished adding the rust, grime, and corrosion to the surfaces, selling that this was a ship that had not seen much care and attention in a very long time. Building terrain and painting models is typically my go-to when I'm stressed out. I can work on tiny details that I can control when I can't control some of the bigger things in life. The holidays were tough for me and my family. There was a lot of bad news, so I focused a lot on crafting to offset that, and it was nice to have something productive come out of it. I followed up with a piece of sponge and bright orange paint that I put down on the heaviest spots of rust and corrosion, and then I came through with the brown wash to tie it all together. This final step was a huge relief to me as it was essentially done. I came back later and added some spots of blood spatter and slime to a couple areas on the deck, but fundamentally this was the final step. Painting each of these tiles has been a huge endeavor. They have a ton of surface area, and this paint is what sells these pieces as being the internals of a huge ship. It's gratifying to get it finished. Here it is, the big reveal. I'm incredibly happy with how this one turned out. The upper deck is ready for Gallowdark bulkheads, and the lower deck is already a playable area. I love the access tunnels running below the deck, and they will work great for having hordes of Tyranids or Chaos Cultists rushing through while Terminators try to hold them back with assault cannons and heavy flamers. With the lights inside, you can see glimpses of the lower decks, and it really sells the sense of it being part of something bigger, with more decks and more areas just out of sight. Overall, I'm really happy with this build, and it pumped me up at a time when I needed it. I went straight into working on the other Gallowdark deck tiles, so be sure to like and subscribe so you can see those as I get the videos finished and posted. If you need any crafting supplies, you can follow the links in the description below. There's also links to my books there, so if you like science fiction and fantasy stories, be sure to check those out. That's all for now. Thank you for watching.